If you have a Bible, would you go ahead and open to Daniel chapter 8? I had the opportunity to read at least some excerpts from a journal by Alexei Navalny. Some of you may remember him. He actually died mysteriously February of this year, but he was a Russian politician, kind of opposed to the current Russian regime. And in November of 2020, he was poisoned, and it became clear that he was poisoned by his government because they wanted to silence him. He was in Germany recuperating. He was committed to his ideals and to his people, went back to Russia knowing the risk, and sure enough, he stepped off the plane and into custody, and he never came out of prison. While he was there, he was treated very poorly, tortured, neglected, all these different kinds of things. It was kind of reminiscent of the old Soviet days, his experience. Even his attorneys were eventually charged in just all different kinds of things, seeking to disrupt and to punish and to stop him. And while he was in prison, he had actually multiple trials, some of which he was not able to be at. He was sentenced to 2.5 years on one offense, 9 years on another, 19 on another, so it was 30 years and counting when he died. And his journal, at least the parts that I read, which was just very brief excerpts, was surprising. It was arresting to me. Here's a man who didn't seem to have any obvious bitterness. He was upset. He was not happy. He was very clear on what he thought was right and wrong, but he didn't seem to be eaten up with bitterness or even depression. He seemed to be somebody who, in the midst of all that he was going through, was able to persevere with hope. And at times, even seemed to be a little bit, in a qualified way, joyful in the midst of what he was doing. And that just really struck me, because when I am not doing well, when things are going poorly, they're nothing like Alexei experienced. I've not experienced anything even remotely near what he experienced. And yet, it's easy to get kind of dark and down and grumbly and whatever. And as I was reading his excerpts, one of the things that came up is there seemed to be two themes that seemed to be anchoring him. In addition to, I'm just not going to compromise. This is what matters. This is what's right, so I'm going to stand for this. How he seemed to be able to do that were two things. One was, he expected it to be hard. He knew it was going to be really hard. In fact, he expected to die. And at one point, fairly early in his incarceration, his wife was allowed to visit him. And they made a pact together about not hoping foolishly, about expecting the hard things so that they wouldn't be surprised. And if things went better, that's great, but let's be realistic here and let's treat this seriously. And then the other thing was this constant refrain, this will end. This will end. What's going on in my country and the things that are happening will not last forever. They never do. And those two realities, that it's going to be hard, but I'm going to persevere, and this is not forever, this is going to change, seem to really buoy him up. And in his case, he didn't survive. He actually didn't think he would survive, but in the journey, he seemed to have a more hopeful spirit, and at times could even be a little bit lighthearted. That reminds me of the passage we're looking at this morning in Daniel 8. Because Daniel 8 is basically saying this is going to be hard. I mean, really, really hard. But it's only for a time. It's for a short time, and you can do this. There's the ability to not compromise, the ability to maintain integrity and to go through this. right? Daniel 8 is continuing the kind of overarching themes of the book. There are several lessons, 3 that show up in this passage that are woven through everything. God rules, God cares, God wins. Those are the primary messages from Daniel. And there's a 4th one kind of interwoven. God has his reasons for what he's doing, right? But God rules. It's all in his control. Whether it looks that way or not, he actually is in control, and things will unfold as he has ordained. God cares when his people are in a hard place, when it's hard, when they're hurting, when they're struggling, when they're persecuted, when things are not going well. He doesn't abandon. He walks through those things with us and cares for us. And sometimes he works mighty deliverances from, and sometimes he works deliverances through, but he's always going to take care of us. And then the final thing, God wins. The very things that make us so righteously indignant. This is wrong, this is unjust, this is evil. Those things God notices too. And though he is patient and though he is merciful, he is also just, and he does win. Each time somebody lifts himself up or herself up to oppose God, they will lose. And there's this pattern in history that's woven through what it means to be human, really, to kind of lift ourselves up. And we're going to see that pattern again here in chapter 8. So it's going to visit some of those same territories. The thing that this chapter does differently is it really begins to dive into more details. Right, we've looked at some very specific stories of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, so very individuals. But the kind of the bigger grand scheme stories, the bigger grand scheme truths have been fairly broad in general. Right, God's in control. It would be easy enough to read these passages and even look at our lives and say, well, I know God's in control, but kind of expect that to be at the broad brushstroke level. And say, but what about this thing right here, right now? What do I do with this? Right, in this passage, it gets into incredible detail. So much detail, in fact, that those who are skeptical of God actually writing the Bible have used it to say Daniel could not have written this chapter. Daniel could not have had this vision. Somebody had it later. They're writing it as a story and saying Daniel had it because the details here are way too intricate. There's no way somebody in, say, 550 BC could discern these things that take place from about 540 BC to 164 BC with incredible detail. Nobody could guess that, so it obviously had to be written after 164 BC. Well, it was written by Daniel, but he had God telling him, and God is telling him because God knows and God is in control, and it's all that detail that actually gives us fresh encouragement. The passage itself is dense, and I have to be honest, it is the hardest one that I've done so far and one of the hardest ever, because not only is the passage dense, but then you get to the end of it and go, and the point is, other than these broad lessons we've been getting all along, and let's revisit those, which is worthy of doing. We don't want to minimize that. But as I've wrestled with it, I think, but here's an aspect that could be really fruitful. So at the end, we'll look at that and try to tease out and maybe wrestle with some of the implications of exactly how God shows us his control and his work and his care in this passage. But in order to do that, we're going to need God's help. So if you would pray with me. Lord, thank you for your word, and for your faithfulness, and for the way that you work in our lives. You include us in what you're doing. You even show us things before they happen sometimes and prepare us. Would you be with us in this place, in this time right now? Be with each one who's in this room and each one who's watching online. Lord, may we know your Spirit's work in our heart through the word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I think it'll be a little easier if I do what I did last time and kind of tip a hand. So if you want to take Daniel 8, would you look first at verse 20, kind of jump in the middle of the story. Daniel has a vision. There are 2 creatures, a ram and a goat. And to pull some of the mystery out of it so it's a little easier to understand, verse 20, he's getting an answer, part of the interpretation that's given to him by an angel. And these are the angel's words. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So all along, Daniel has been showing us in different times, in different ways, there's 4 kingdoms from his perspective: Babylon, and then Media, Persia, then Greece, then Rome. There's other views, but that's by far the strongest from what we can see in the Word of God here. So that's what we've been going with, and very convinced of that. So last week he had the vision of 4 beasts, and it had all 4 of those. This week he has a vision of 2 beasts, and it's number 2 and number 3. Media, Persia, and Greece. And having that little bit of information will help us as we go through. There's going to be things about the vision. Remember, Daniel is in the city of Babylon, but he has a vision that takes him to the city of Susa. That's another it would be like I'm in the city of New York, but in the vision I went to the city of Los Angeles. Watched the World Series, saw the Dodgers do great. Now I got to go back to New York. How disappointing. Oh, did I get distracted there? Sorry. So he's in Babylon and he's in his head, but God's in his head too, and God is showing him things. So none of this stuff is physically happening, but all of this stuff is a picture God is giving him to say this is exactly how things will unfold. So as we're there, then these images will show us, here's things to know about Greece, here's things to know about Persia, both of which are future from Daniel's point of view. Daniel is still in Babylon. He probably writes this about 550 BC, give or take, because it's in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, which we don't know exactly, because Belshazzar technically wasn't the king. His dad was, but his dad moved away and said, run the store. And exactly when that happened is not clear, but roughly in that zone, which is also roughly the time this upstart guy named Cyrus, who's a Persian, goes to battle against his grandfather, Astyages the Mede, and conquers and brings the Mede and Persian kingdoms together. And in secular sources, usually we just call it Persia or Media. But when we look at it here, it's really clear that there's this dynamic where they're brought together. And so you can call it Persia, you can call it Medo-Persia, whatever it is. That's what it is, and there's aspects of how this unfolds that say, wow, there's stuff that there's maybe just the very beginnings of the story of Media Persia, Daniel would have been watching from a distance, but there's all these things that are unfolding, all these details that he couldn't possibly have known, and yet he does, because God is saying, look, I'm in control, I'm ruling, and here's how things are going to go. I'm telling you that because there's some bad guys coming, and they will lose. You need to know that because you're going to be in a hard place. And I want you to be prepared because I do care, but you're going to go through some really hard stuff. But it's going to be limited by me. And you can do this. Okay, so let's pick up the flow here. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. That's the last vision, chapter 7, right? So, okay, here I'm having a second vision. I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns. Both the horns were high, but one was higher than the other. The higher one came up last. Media preceded Persia. Media was the stronger kingdom initially, and then by the time Cyrus joins them, Persia becomes the stronger one. But they're together now. 1 beast, 2 horns, one's higher than the other. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. Now, Daniel is seeing before the fact that Persia is now going to be the next ruling empire of the world, a position they will occupy for around 200 years. And it hasn't happened yet. He can see rumblings, but there's no way he could know for sure what's going to happen. Babylon is still in power, and yet Media Persia is going to take over, and he gives us all that. And as he does that, it's against the backdrop of the rest of the book. One of the things that we read into this properly is that it's not just about human events, it's about human hearts. And so he gives us little clues. Throughout the book, he's shown us that there's this dynamic of people setting themselves up in opposition to God. And he gives us clues that Persia's doing this too. Because when he talks about the ram's horns, for instance, he says one horn is higher than the other. Now, we're not particularly agrarian, but if you were going to describe an animal and its horns, would you say how high the horn is? You talk about how long the horn is, right? Which they would have done too. Understand what it means when it's high, but I think that's an illusion. It's trying to draw in a little of the flavor to say, yeah, it's not just a long horn. These people are kind of uppity. They're cocky. They're lifting themselves up. And it has some of that same flavor when it says at the end, he did as he pleased, and he became great. Right? This is all about, we're going to do what we want. We're in charge. So we see the pattern that's been unfolding, and Medo-Persia is the next entity, this ram. So then verse 5, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. This goat is flying, right? Literally, figuratively, it is just a dart aimed at the heart of the ram. It is coming hard, it is coming fast, and we know from what we already read, this is to be Greece. And Greece, the first king, I guess you could say, technically of the united group would be Philip of Macedon, but he didn't take it where his son did, Alexander the Great. He was great, you can tell because he even told us so in his name. He's Alexander the Great. That's me. Just know me as the great one, right? But he really was. He was amazing. He conquered all of the world that he cared about, essentially in 10 years, essentially all the world that mattered to them. And he did that from age 23 to age 33. Right? He just blazed through the world, and his number one enemy was Greece. I mean, it was not Greece, that was his friends, that was him. His number one enemy was Persia, right? If you're familiar with some of the stories, there's movies or phrases. You may even drive around town, and you may not be able to read it because it's in Greek, so probably you can't. But some people, and usually it's on a big pickup truck, and it'll say molon labe, which means come and take. And that's a quote, supposedly, from the Spartan general who stood his ground when Xerxes, the Persian, said, lay down your weapons. And he's like, come and take them. And then, cool movies came from there, right? That was what happened. And all the Spartans died, but boy, they were heroic. And there's this long history between Greece and Persia. And so when Alexander comes to power, he's going to deal with Persia first. They have been annoying, they have been dominating, they have been a thorn, they have been just going to get rid of them. In fact, he seems to unite his people around this attack on Persia, and he just hammers them, right? None of this would be accessible to Daniel. This is 200 years, more than 200 years, 220 years after Daniel's writing this. And yet the details unfold as if it's already happened and Daniel's just watching. Because he is in a vision given by God. He comes flying in from the west. He had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I'd seen standing on the bank of the canal. He ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. He cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. That's the end of the Persian Empire. Alexander's come to town, and he wins. Then the goat, Greece, became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Alexander died at age 33 while he was still on campaign. And suddenly there's a crisis. He's a 33-year-old, brand new, minted emperor who's conquered the world. Now what happens to the kingdom? He's got kids. He's got a couple of sons, in fact, but he's 33. His sons are not very old. They're not very capable of ruling in his stead. He didn't live long enough for that. Chaos ensues, and the kingdom of Greece, the empire, gets divided into 4 major kingdoms, and 4 key generals wind up ruling those kingdoms. And they become the emperors of those lesser but still powerful kingdoms. That's what we know from history. Here's what it says in Daniel. The great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, toward the glorious land. We'll come back to the little horn in a minute. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and the host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Something horrible is happening here. Then I heard a holy one speaking. Remember, Daniel's in a vision, right? So he's watching the vision unfold, and then there's another layer to the vision because there's angels in the vision who aren't active in that part of the vision. They're standing around and watching it with him, and he overhears 2 angels talking to each other. One holy one speaking to another holy one and said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state." We're going to come back to that in a minute. I want to get the rest of the general history, then we're going to come back to the little horn. When I, Daniel, had seen this vision, I sought to understand it. Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called Gabriel, "Make this man understand the vision." So obviously that's God speaking to Gabriel, saying, "Talk to Daniel, give him a clue." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. Right? An angelic being in any form of its normal glory is a terrifying thing. Right? And when people encounter angels knowingly, when they're not kind of veiled, they freak out. They either want to worship them or they just collapse. Daniel does the latter. Right? So it's no wonder in Exodus when Moses wants to see God himself, God says, "You cannot see my glory and live. It would kill you." Right? This is just an angel, and Daniel's terrified. He falls on his face, but he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end." When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep. In other words, he passes out with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up, and he said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, those are the kings of Media and Persia." We already saw that. "And the goat is the king of Greece. The great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power." Greece is going to fall apart, but not fully. There's going to be these lesser rulers who split it up and still kind of control the world. At the latter end of their kingdom, sometime well into their rule, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, somebody who's really arrogant, one who understands riddles shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction. He shall succeed in what he does, destroy mighty men, the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. And in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Okay, let's grab a couple things from the end first, and then we'll go back and unpack particularly this little horn. One of the verses that people can easily stumble on is when it says, "Seal up the vision." Is he saying, wait, you just revealed all this, now hide it? He is not saying that. That's what we think of. That's not what Daniel would have thought of. It's write this down, seal it up in a scroll so that it is accessible when it is needed. This has to be preserved because what's happening is coming a long time from now. I don't want this vision to be lost. I don't want this vision to be forgotten. It needs to be available, so make sure it is. Then after Daniel has the explanation, he still doesn't understand it all. He's still confused, which is an encouragement in an odd sort of way for us. If you read God's word, sometimes you go, I get a lot of it, but man, I don't understand. Well, I think we can safely say Daniel was better than you, and he didn't either. Daniel was better than me, he didn't either, right? There's some things that aren't intended for us to fully understand. And when we come to something like prophecy, that's actually a big thing. One of the challenges is how do I make sure that I listen to this carefully, fully, really dive into it without trying to squeeze out of it stuff God has not intended for me to understand. There are things he's not revealed. He's given me enough. And it's a hard place sometimes. It actually can be a place of idolatry. Not just with this, with all kinds of things. It can be, here, how do you parent, or there's all kinds of things. I come to God's word and I demand to have answers in the form that I want, at the level that I want, and that's idolatrous. This is not a God is responding to me to answer my questions book. This is a God is revealing himself and everything to me from his point of view and what he wants to share. So Daniel is left with some questions, and he's really troubled. Right? He's seen some things. He knows enough to say, really tough stuff is coming. And I'm not sure I like it. It literally makes him sick. But then, what else can he do? He goes back to being faithful to what he's called to do. He still trusts God, but he doesn't know how this is all going to work out. He has got the broad contours, but it's challenging. Right? Sometimes that's where we are. And sometimes we may even find ourselves really wrestling, struggling, hurting, maybe even getting sick over the things that are going on. And God is not necessarily going to give us the level of answer that would make us go, okay, I'm good. This passage maybe is helpful in that regard too. Let's look at this little horn, because he's central to the text, and then when we ask our kind of final question, it'll come out of that. Who's the little horn? If you've been listening carefully, reading carefully, you know that there's a little horn in the last chapter. Are they the same person? A lot of people immediately assume little horn must be the same person because they sound alike, right? I was reading an old letter from a friend last night for various reasons, and I laughed because of what he was reminding me in the letter. In 2005, I was on an Air Blue, not JetBlue, but an Air Blue flight from Karachi, Pakistan to Islamabad, Pakistan, with this friend who was living in Pakistan at the time. And the captain came on the loudspeaker like captains do in those flights and went blah, 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 blah. I mean, he was speaking in English, but it's hard to understand whatever's coming out of those speakers. It wouldn't matter what language you're speaking. What are you saying? What are you saying? But I'm listening carefully. And a couple of things did strike me, because as he's telling about how the flight's going to be and all of those things, he says, your needs will be attended to by our 2 flight attendants, Miss Manure. I don't think I want Miss Manure to be handing me my drink and my nuts. Please, Miss Manure, do not touch them. Do not come near them. And she's assisted in the cabin by Miss Nausea. Right? Really? A flight attendant named Miss Nausea. Where's the little bag? Right? Now, those are their actual real names. I was rereading it, and he said, yep, those are their names. They just sound that way. They're not spelled anything like manure or nausea that we would think of. They mean something totally different. In fact, that country, they're actually not uncommon names. But if I just come and say, well, it doesn't make any sense. When we come to the scripture, we have to be careful, because we need to make sure that we take it in context as it is. Daniel's prior usage is part of the context, yes. It's very different than saying, well, little horn means this to me. That doesn't matter. But Daniel does use it that way. But has he given us any reason to think they're the same? Or are they just similar? Because they clearly are similar. If you look at chapter 7, there's this little horn that rises up who represents this great king who's going to wreak havoc. He's going to be stomping down the people of God. He's going to be doing all kinds of terrible things. And in that context, it's really clear that is the Antichrist, the one who comes at the end of time, who is still future from us. But he comes out of the 4th kingdom. 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 And there's not 4 horns, there's 10 horns. And it's like there's a lot of differences between these two images. This is the third kingdom. And there's this little horn. Not the same little horn. Doing a lot of the same things. And in fact, that's part of the issue, right? Because this little horn here, it says he's got great power, but he didn't even get it on his own. Did you catch that? This passage is kind of just peeling back the veil. It is so easy for you and me to look at life strictly in terms of what's right in front of us at a human level. And that's really important. But remember, in the New Testament, Paul says, and the Spirit inspires him to say it, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of this present darkness. So be armed. Wear your armor. You have a spiritual battle that's going on. Right? Your adversary, the devil, Peter says, is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. There is more that goes on in this world than just the politics and the culture and the choices and the values and the actions of human beings. And in this passage, it's really leaning into that human side, but it just kind of begins to peel back the veil just a little bit and says there's a whole lot more going on here. And that's part of what the little horn is all about, because this is something Satan is working in the world, and he's got a plan that he likes. So this little horn is really a good picture, not by accident, of the Antichrist who's to come at the end. And he's not the only one. If you read 1 John 2, for instance, he talks about Antichrist. He said, you know, you're looking for Antichrist, that's great. Actually, there's been a lot of Antichrists already. So this little horn is not the same little horn, just as it says when the angel talks to Daniel, he calls him Son of Man. And in chapter 7, Son of Man is like Jesus. He's the powerful Son of God coming in the clouds. This time it's just Daniel who's laying on his face because he's scared to death of the angel. That's not the same Son of Man, right? They're used differently. This little horn is similar, but he is not the same. So this one comes out of the Greek setting, and this is actually where the chapter gets so precise that it's very hard for people who don't accept God can actually interact to accept this passage as prophecy. Because as the story unfolds, after the kingdom of Alexander, the empire is broken up, there's these different kingdoms, and we'll get more of this in chapter 11. By the way, the spiritual warfare thing we're passing over because chapter 10, 2 weeks, Charlie's going to do chapter 10. It is just all over that passage. So we'll leave that for him. But just be aware, there's more going on in the world, and be sensitive to that as a Christian. But as the empire of Alexander is divided amongst these kings, and as things unfold over time, the king from basically Syria is where his headquarters is. Syria, Babylon is the chunk that he got, but he headquarters in Syria. There's these ups and downs, particularly in Egypt and Syria. These two kings go back and forth a lot against each other. That's a lot of chapter 11. But near the end of that time, there's this guy who comes to power named Antiochus. Antiochus is actually part of the royal family. He is not the heir to the throne. His nephew is. And it is through his trickery, did you read about his deceit and all those things? It's through his trickery that he actually becomes the king. He's very effective. He makes major conquests and does major battles and does major damage to the east, as it says here. And he has major campaigns against Armenia, Parthia, and Persia, where he shows great success. Major campaign to the south, and he has great success against Egypt. Major campaign in the beautiful land. He conquers Palestine, holds them oppressed. And technically, they were part of his kingdom, and except when Egypt took them away. There's this battle going on. But he's got major workings there. That's all called out by Daniel. Antiochus lives in the 170s, 160s BC. So we're talking 550 to 170. Was that 380 years? It's a long time to be guessing. Antiochus also does everything that's said here, right? He devastates the Jewish people. One source says that he murdered 80,000 Jewish people. He overthrows the Jewish practice of religion and tries to replace it with something pagan. And he had this view of himself as being the great one. In fact, he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the great and glorious one, the one who reveals, the one who's so glorious, right? Of course, behind his back, you'd never say this to his face because you wouldn't have a face of your own if you did. They called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means the crazy madman. Nobody liked him. But he had this incredible power. And he used it to great damaging effect on the Jewish people. Not only does he commit all these murders, and he overthrows their religious system. In 170 BC, the Jewish high priest, a man named Onias III, most likely, from what we can tell, was assassinated, and the high priesthood was sold to somebody else, and Antiochus was involved in all of that. At a later point, a little bit later, he just stops at some point, we don't know exactly when, he stops the nightly sacrifice and the morning sacrifice. He stops the whole sacrificial system. He sets up an item of worship to Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem. And then he sacrifices a pig on the altar of God. Talk about somebody who is absolutely thumbing his nose at God, shaking his fist at God. That's Antiochus. And all of those things are embedded in this passage in great detail. Right? And Antiochus dies not by his own hand. His power is broken, but not by the power of man, it says, right? Shortly after things change in Israel in 164, he dies suddenly. The Jewish sources suggest that he found out that he'd lost the battle in Israel because he's on a different campaign in a different country, and that's why he died. But there's other countries, too, that he's ravaged, and one of them says, you kind of mocked our God, and our God got back at you, and he killed you, right? Probably some disease or something that came up, may have looked like very natural causes, may have had very natural causes, but we know that behind that, at the very least, is God and his judgment. Because God, he's raising his fist against God. He is great. He is great as God himself, is what it says in the first part. But then later on it says, well, he's great in his own mind, and that's the clarifier. We're looking at the vision, seeing how things kind of look, and everyone would say, wow, he's winning. He's fighting God, and he's winning. And God's like, no. Read the Psalms. People do that, and I just laugh. Have you not read that psalm? No, he's not in control. He's not as great as me. And his life will be taken from him like that. And the things that he's doing, I have allowed for my inscrutable purposes. I have allowed them, but they are limited. They are precisely limited. There's exactly 2,300 days of this ultimate expression where he shuts down the worship of God. That's it. No more, no less. Not 2,274 days, not 2,368 days. Sometimes when numbers are used, they are used for approximations. Sometimes there's symbolic reasons. As I look at 2,300 and have wrestled with it, I think it's just exact. It's just that's the number, 2,300 days. And that's where I want to give us a little time to think here, because the bigger picture is pretty clear, right? Hard things happen. God's in ultimate control. Antiochus, whenever the clock started exactly, in December of 164 BC, a Jewish warlord named Judas, called Maccabeus. That's actually his nickname. It means hammer. So he was this soft-spoken, genteel kind of guy, right? Judas the Hammer. And his sons, who are also called the Maccabees, that's, in fact, if you look at the Apocrypha, there's 1st and 2nd Maccabees. That's the whole story of this stuff, right? Throws off the rule of Antiochus and restores worship in the temple. That's where the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah comes from. That's from December of 164 BC. So the precision of this text is just extraordinary. Great detail. God's got it absolutely in control. But what I want to look at is that idea of 2,300 days. if you just want to look again, verse 14, he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, that's how long this is going to go on, and then it's going to change. I think there's some things for us to look at. Yes, in the bigger picture, once again, we see God is ruling. Once again, we see God wins. The bad guy gets judged. Once again, we even see his care because he's limited the trial here to 2,300 days. But as I've wrestled with that particular verse, it does strike me that there's a couple of other things that might be helpful for us as we wrestle with this implications. And that is, first off, it's ambiguous. It's 2,300 days. When do they start? When do they stop? Roughly, these are the things that are going to be happening. Does it start with the death of Onias, the high priest, which is one option? Does it start when he stops the sacrifice, which we wouldn't know? They would know. But is that when it starts? Does it start when he sets up the thing to Zeus in the temple? Does it start with the sacrifice of the pig? When does this thing start? Nobody even going through it would know for certain. They would have opinions, they'd have ideas, they probably even would argue about it, but they wouldn't know. God knows, they don't. He gave them enough information so that this is very obvious, very specific, very controlled, and I'll give you the broad enough strokes for you to respond, but you don't need to know those details. When does it end? Does it end with Judas restoring the temple, or does it end a little bit later when Antiochus dies? We don't know. They wouldn't have known. It's ambiguous. And in fact, there's a greater ambiguity that's embedded here that I think they would have had as well. Because the actual text says, for 2,300 evenings, mornings. That's it. For 2,300 evenings, mornings. So is that 2,300 evening and morning? Evening and morning is the first. Where do you put your parentheses? You math people? Well, how do you group this? Right? Is it 2,300 evening mornings? In which case, that's 2,300 days. Around 6 years. Or is it 2,300 evenings and 2,300 mornings? Is it the distributive property that we're working with here? Right? Because it's evening and morning. There's the evening sacrifice, there's the morning sacrifice, he's ending the sacrifice. How do we know? We don't. We can argue over it. There's reasons and battling back and forth from scholars and teachers. And those arguments would have likely been the same for them. It's embedded in the actual text itself. It doesn't make it super clear. So he's telling people, here's exactly what's going to happen, but you can't know exactly. Kind of exactly. I mean, it's exactly going to happen this way, but you're only going to kind of exactly know. I exactly know, but that's all you need to know. And I think that ambiguity that's there is really helpful because it forces some questions that I think are worth asking. How often is it in my life when I just want to know? I just want to know. If I could just know, how long is this going to happen? How is this going to unfold? Why is this happening? What is this going to look like? How do I get there? When I want to know, I mean, that's natural. That's even appropriate up to a point. But how often does it like God has stopped talking before I have stopped wondering? Like, I need more information. If you would just give me that, I'd be fine. I trust you, God, but. And it strikes me that I have to ask a real important question. Am I trusting God's system so I know what's happening? Here's how it works. Here's wisdom. Here's the answers. Here's the promises. Here's the special things that he does. I'm trusting that. Or am I trusting a person? God himself, who's free to give me what he wants to give me when he wants to give it to me, and he leaves me in the dark on many things. And if I continually struggle because I don't have enough information, I suspect I'm not actually trusting God at all. I'm trusting his plan. But it's not even, I'm trusting his plan. He's got one and I'm going to trust that. It's like, no, he needs to submit that to me. I may not even be for approval, just for understanding. I just need to know. Embedded in this text that is absolutely written to say, this is coming, be ready. Here's everything you need to know, and there's some stuff that you actually can't know. I think that's really critical. I think that's really, really helpful. Do I have a transactional or a relational connection with God? And when things get surprising, difficult, mysterious, painful, hard, the things that will throw me off balance, what do I lean into? I don't know the answers. I know God. He gave them enough of an answer to say, I've got this. It is short. It's going to feel like forever to you. But it's actually short, and it will end. And I've given you enough. But you will always be guessing. I think that's really a critical thing. The other thing I think about this is it's limited, right? There's a suffering that's only going to take place for so long. The scriptures are full of passages that talk about that. Psalm 13 says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And it's not the only psalm that just talks that way. It's like, wow, when is this going to end? God doesn't necessarily give me a lot of details. In this case, he gave them a fair amount, but it would still be ambiguous. But it will end. It's going to be short. 2 Corinthians 4 says that it is a momentary light affliction. Momentary? Light? Really? Doesn't feel that way. Well, before we say that's naive, we need to remember it's Paul who wrote that, who also tells us, and he's not even through the toughest part of his ministry. He's still kind of in the early parts of it, mid-part maybe. And he's like, well, okay, I've been shipwrecked this many times. I've been snake bit, beaten, left for dead, stoned, imprisoned. I've been in the sea overnight, It's like, whoa, okay. That guy knew what it was to really experience hard things. And he's the one that God says, tell him that this momentary light affliction will be worth it. It's momentary in terms of the bigger picture God is doing, which is what I can lose sight of. And it's light in comparison with what God will accomplish through it, which is what I can lose sight of. As Daniel is telling people things that make him sick, there's a fundamental truth. There's a limit. It's only going to go so far, right? I was thinking about how this cashes out, and I remembered a testimony of a couple who lived, she still lived in a Muslim nation. And there was a Christian hospital across the street from the husband's store. And he was violently opposed to the Christian ministry. And so he's doing everything he could to end the ministry, to cause trouble, etc. And then he contracted cancer. And it was an incurable cancer, and it was kind of a slow-moving cancer, but it was this inexorable march to death through a pretty hard road. And his particular community was pretty, they believed things they shouldn't believe. My vocabulary just leaked out of my head right now. They were afraid they were going to catch it, so they stayed away. Well, this guy runs a store. If everyone stays away, not only are you now painfully and slowly dying of cancer and alone, you also have no funds to take care of yourself and your family. Well, when the Christians from the hospital discovered that, they started frequenting his store, spending time with him, encouraging him, praying for him, everything they could to just show him love, even though he was the one who was very violently opposed to them. And over time, God used that, his heart softened, he came to faith. His wife came to faith. Her name was Aisha, and he passed. So now Aisha is this young wife with some small children, alone in a culture that doesn't give her a lot of advantages, and she's a Christian in a culture that's very opposed to that. But she's very outgoing and vibrant and sharing her faith with everyone and everyone in their family and all of her neighbors and all of her friends. And it seems like a great thing from a Christian point of view, but from Aisha's life standing, it turned out very difficult because eventually the authorities said, we got to shut her down, and they took her into custody and they threw her in jail. Only they didn't throw her into a normal jail cell. The police offices had the jail cells, but they just lifted the trapdoor and threw her down in the subflooring area. It was a raised foundation, so she's under there in the dirt with the rats and the roaches and the spiders, and then they close it, and it's pitch black, and so all these things are scuttering around her, and it's terrifying. And she's there because she's been faithful, and and at one point, she just comes to the end of herself, and she is convinced, I can't do this anymore. And she starts to just cry out to God with all of her frustration, her anger, her fear, all of this stuff. Only in the moment she opens her mouth, God meets her. And instead of all of that coming boiling out, a praise song comes out, which surprises even her. But then she sings it joyfully, and she's immediately under all these police officers' offices, right? And one by one, each office, the scooching of chairs and stomp, it all goes quiet because everyone is listening to Aisha sing praise to God. That night, the trap door opens. It's the chief of police. He grabs her, he lifts her out and says, come on, you get to go home. Oh, wait. Well, this is not a good time to go home. No, it's going to be okay. I'll walk with you. It'll be fine. But here's the deal. You need to come over to my house in 3 days because I'll have my family gathered there. And everyone in my family gets scared of everything. They're just crazy. I want you to tell them how you're not scared, why that's the case, and I want you to sing that song for them. Right, so it was a huge opportunity. But for our purposes this morning, the thing that struck me is you remember in Corinthians where it talks about temptations and testings and struggles and things that come along. And so there's no temptation that you're going to experience that isn't a common temptation. And God, I'm paraphrasing very loosely here, but the idea is God knows your limits. He's not going to allow you to be pressed beyond what you can handle. There'll be a way of escape. In her case, she was pressed to the very brink, and in that moment, God met her, and it changed everything. Now, there were a lot of people who died in the persecution of Antiochus. So God's deliverance can take different forms. But if I'm his and I'm looking at things eternally, dying is really not the worst thing that could happen to me, is it? But he meets us. He meets us. He's the one who says, this is momentary. This is light. There's a limit. God will move speedily on your behalf. Will you trust me? When I come back, will there be faith on the earth? Look that one up. That's Luke 18. Or will all of the hardship that seems so long to you, but isn't really long, God's got it in control, will that somehow stop you? I think the fact that he's given them this answer, but he's not given them everything they would want is really helpful. I don't know how long this is. I don't know when it starts, and I don't know when it stops. But God does, and nothing whatever will change that. That is absolutely in his control. That is absolutely in his hand, and so am I. And whatever hardship I'm facing, those principles still carry forward for his children. Whatever I'm facing, he is in it. And I may not like it. It may be really hard, and I may have no idea how long it's going to go on. But he does, and he's got a plan, and he's going to carry me through it. And he just wants me to be prepared to trust him. To trust him. Lord, I thank you for your grace and the fact that you are trustworthy. And I pray that you would help us as people to lean into that, to lean into the relationship we have with you. Lord, some of us are in hard places. I would ask that you'd remove that. We'd be fools not to ask. We ask that you'd take the hard things away. Lord, I know sometimes you do. Sometimes you do. But if these are hard things that we have right now that are meant for our good and for your purposes, would you help us to trust you in them, experience you in them, walk with you in them? Give us the grace and the strength we need, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.